Once upon a time in the 1970s, the Soviet Union was the global superpower that was the second most successful economy in the world. At its peak, it produces 12.58 million barrels of oil per day, which was 20% of the entire world's oil production. The Soviet oil export revenues amounted to $3,100 per capita, higher than any developed countries at the time. And the Soviet Union had the world's largest supply of untapped energy resources such as oil, natural gas, and other unconventional types of oil like shale oil and heavy oil. But despite all this, the Soviet Union is no more, and its oil dominance and dependency actually played a major part in the Soviets' devastating collapse. Now, the standard theory of the Soviet collapse is that socialism could have never worked, and it was a big mistake to try this very inefficient system in the first place. In other words, it's just a matter of time until everything fell apart, and it eventually did. But I would like to argue that the Soviet planned economy isn't actually that inefficient, albeit quite underwhelming, and the Soviet Union could actually survive till this day given some very specific conditions were met. After all, they did survive for 70 plus years and were once the second biggest economy in the world, so they must have done something right. But at the same time, this whole planned economy system can become spectacularly inefficient when these conditions are not met. As you can guess, one of those key conditions is oil. As long as the Soviet had oil, it is very likely to survive. But once oil scarcity hits, then the Soviet planned economy is just not good enough to quickly reallocate scarce resources. It is far from a coincidence that when Soviet oil production declined massively from 1985 to the 1990s, the country immediately went through a significant crisis and began its experiment with the thing it hates the most: capitalism. So, what the hell happened? In this video, we will examine the Soviet oil industry from its highest of highs until its lowest of lows, and how the Soviet oil crisis pretty much sealed the fate of the Soviet Union. Alright, so in the first part of this channel's video about Soviet oil, we're at the part when the Soviet Union had just hit a jackpot in finding massive amounts of oil in the Volga-Ural region, located just north of Kazakhstan here on the map. To illustrate how big this discovery was for the Soviet Union, the region was producing 80% of the Soviets' entire oil output for at least 20 years, and even today, it still produces about 20% of Russia's total oil output. The Volga-Ural region alone made the Soviet the world's second largest oil producer after the USA, and also the world's largest oil exporter. And this all continued from the end of World War II all the way to the late 1960s, as the Soviet Union competed with the USA over global supremacy. But this all changed in the 1970s, because after decades of intensive exploitation, the region's oil reserves started to decline very rapidly, faster than any Soviet central planners ever imagined. This happened because a lot of the reservoirs in the Volga-Ural region naturally had low recovery rates and also high water cut. Basically, this just meant that more water than oil was extracted from the oil wells. Moreover, the Soviets often used aggressive oil extraction methods, like water flooding, to meet the required quota by the state. But this only damaged the reservoir and worsened the situation. And during this time, the Soviet was competing with the USA over the latest military technologies, nuclear weapons, and space exploration, that most of the state investment went there instead of its oil sector. Many of the oil wells were poorly maintained, leading to leaks, oil spills, not to mention dangerous accidents. The Soviet central planners forecasted the oil reserve to decline by 150 million tons per year, but in reality, they declined by 270 million tons per year. All of this was really bad for the Soviets, as most of their political and economic policies were centered around oil. For starters, oil was the single biggest source of the Soviets' foreign currency at 50%. The Soviets were not exactly an exporting country, but if there was a commodity that had much value that the Soviets were willing to sell to other countries, it is oil. Another important use of oil for the Soviets was as a political tool, as the Soviets continuously delivered cheap oil to pretty much the entire Eastern Bloc. including Cuba, Vietnam, and North Korea as well. Of course, these oil exports were made not because the Soviets expected countries like Yugoslavia or North Korea to pay them handsomely, as they barely had any money, but rather to buy their loyalty and have them side with the Soviets in the Cold War, as well as controlling the country's policies for their own interests. So, considering how important oil was to the Soviet Union, the decline of oil reserves in the Volga-Ural region could potentially have a massive impact on the Soviets' existence. And had not a series of very lucky events happened around the 1970s, the Soviet Union may have collapsed much earlier. There are two very lucky events that I'm going to talk about here: the discovery of large oil reserves in Western Siberia and the 1973 OPEC oil crisis. Let's talk about the oil discovery in Western Siberia first. Now, the reason I told you that this is a lucky event is that for one reason or another, Soviet central planners never really believed that the oil in Western Siberia actually exists, at least until they saw it with their own eyes. You see, even in the 1930s, 10 years before oil was found in the Volga-Ural region, Soviet geologists already pointed out the possibility that there was lots of oil in Western Siberia, potentially way more oil than what they found in the Volga-Ural region. But maybe Soviet central planners thought that this was just rumor, or a CIA spy planted fake information so the Soviets would invest money heavily in useless projects. For 30 long years, rumors of oil in Western Siberia kept circulating, but the Soviets were pretty happy with the oil in the Volga-Ural region, which made them a superpower. But as the oil reserve in the Volga-Ural region declined way faster than anyone ever imagined, they basically had no other choice and finally acted to explore oil in Western Siberia. Even if the oil there really is fake information by a spy, they have to take the risk. And it eventually paid off, as the oil in Western Siberia really did exist and started enriching the Soviet Union. By 1973, a total of 113 oil fields had been discovered, and by 1980, an astonishing 434 million tons of oil were extracted. Western Siberia became the third major oil-producing region in the USSR, along with Baku and the Volga-Ural, with Western Siberia becoming the biggest oil-producing region in Soviet's history. And finally, we got to the second lucky event that the Soviets had, the 1973 OPEC oil crisis. This was a crisis that happened because OPEC imposed an oil embargo on countries that supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The oil embargo reduced the global supply of oil, which increased the demand and prices for oil in the world market. The price of oil increased 300% from $3 per barrel in 1973 to $12 per barrel in 1974. This is the oil crisis that threw the whole world into a panic and even caused the USA to go through a long, painful stagflation, combining high inflation plus low economic growth for around 10 years. Now, this oil crisis wasn't bad for all countries. Oil-rich nations like the Middle East, Venezuela, and Mexico benefited massively from this. Even the USA had states like Texas and Alaska thriving during this period, while most other states struggled with stagflation. And the Soviet Union, as a known OPEC oil-rich nation, meaning that they are not part of the oil embargo, took this golden opportunity of high oil prices to export more oil to both socialist and capitalist countries, not only to gain more profit, but also to make the entire Eastern Bloc more dependent on them, securing their loyalty and support. The Soviet oil export revenues rose from $4 billion in 1972 to $14 billion in 1974, a 250% increase. And this increased further to $37 billion in 1980. Combine this with the newfound oil in Western Siberia, and the 1970s were a good time for the Soviet Union as the economy grew at a rate of 5.4% per year, higher than the world average of 4.1% per year. But all of this didn't last long, and the Soviet economy slowed down in the 1980s as it only grew by 2.6% per year, and in 1991, the Soviet Union finally collapsed. So, what happened between this period of massive prosperity to total collapse? Well, First of all, let's talk about some huge problems in Western Siberia. Western Siberia is an area that covers 3.4 million square kilometers, or larger than Mexico, Germany, and Poland combined. And around 1/3 of the entire area was filled with oil. It might not sound like much, but that's still an area 3 times larger than Germany. No wonder that it became the biggest oil-producing region in Soviet history. But extracting oil from Western Siberia is far from easy. The region is remote and underdeveloped, with extremely harsh living conditions. Almost impassable swamps occupy up to 70 to 80% of the region's territory. Geologists and oil workers could only work during winter, when many swamps were frozen enough to be able to hold heavy machinery. Otherwise, the equipment would all drown. During winter, temperatures drop to -30 degrees Celsius and sometimes to -50 degrees Celsius, along with strong northerly wind. Not to mention, when the Soviets first started to work there was no communication equipment whatsoever, and it lacked any kind of social infrastructure because hardly anyone lived there. So, when the Soviets want to extract oil from Western Siberia, they essentially have to build entire cities out of nothing, transporting hundreds of thousands of geologists, builders, and oil workers and their families there, build the necessary infrastructure for those hundreds of thousands of people to survive, and force the workers to live and work during a -50 degrees Celsius freezing winter night. And all food had to be transported from other regions, since farming is basically impossible there. All of this drives up the production costs massively and raises the cost of living higher than that even of Moscow. And Soviet central planners had to double the salaries of workers because hardly anyone wanted to work there. Workers who worked there will immediately quit after 2 years after earning their big paychecks. And this brings us to the second problem. The Soviet central planners, realizing the importance of oil for the survival of the state and facing the declining oil production in the Volga-Ural region, essentially ordered the oil extraction in Western Siberia done as quickly and effectively as possible. And in terms of oil production, it was a major success. The Soviets quickly built long pipelines straight into Europe, and the region started rewarding the Soviets' effort with endless riches. But ecologically, it was an absolute disaster. You see, the reason why the Soviets were able to extract oil and build pipelines so quickly was that they disregarded any kind of safety protocol for sustainable oil production. They spilled large amounts of oil on land and water, which contaminated the soil and swamps. They dumped large amounts of toxic waste into the swamps without proper treatment or disposal. These waste includes drilling mud, chemicals, and radioactive materials. They also injected large amounts of water into the oil reservoir to maintain pressure and enhance its recovery rate. The water injection altered the hydrological balance and caused soil erosion. All of this meant that the Soviets were able to extract large amounts of oil quickly, but these practices were clearly unsustainable. By the way, it's not like the oil workers wanted to damage the environment on purpose, but because the 1970s were a golden opportunity for the Soviets to sell oil as prices were high, the Soviet central planners ordered extremely ambitious production quotas for the oil workers to be met, also to accommodate for the production decline in the Volga-Ural region. These production quotas had to be met by any means necessary. So, they resorted to these methods because they had no other choice. They were constantly pushed to produce more and more oil for the government. And this would actually turn out to be a big problem later on. Now, as I said earlier, the Soviet Union was very dependent on oil, not only as a source of income, specifically foreign currency, but also as a political tool. But this yet again created a huge problem that contributed massively to the Soviets' collapse. You see, because the Soviets kept sending oil to their allies, a lot of them, especially countries like East Germany and Hungary, had become so dependent on Soviet oil. If the Soviets failed to send oil on time, that will have massive political and social repercussions, pretty much dissolving all of the Eastern Bloc and undoing the Soviets' diplomacy attempt for decades. But because the Soviets supplied cheap oil way below market prices to its allies, it was very expensive for the Soviet Union to do this continuously. If, for example, the cost of extracting oil were to become more expensive, then the Soviets cannot pass on these costs by simply raising its prices, and it would have to take losses right in the face. So, in the late 1980s, when the Soviet oil production growth had pretty much turned negative, they had a tough choice to make. Keep sending oil to its allies but risk having an energy crisis domestically, or halt all oil deliveries and risk losing all of its allies to the West. The Soviets quickly decided to prioritize its own needs and halt all oil deliveries. And its Eastern Bloc allies also decided to prioritize their own needs and just as quickly turn to the West. Hence, the dissolvement of the Eastern Bloc. Now, as we've already examined, there are lots of factors that cause the Soviets' oil production to decline. One of them is the decline of Western Siberian oil production. The Soviet central planners initially thought that the region would provide them with endless wealth for generations to come. But what actually happened was that production declined faster than everybody had imagined, probably because of its unsustainable and wasteful extraction. In the 1960s, Soviet oil production grew by 9% per year. In the 1970s, just 6%, and that number pretty much went negative in the 1980s. Desperate for more oil, the Soviets just simply decided to double down and find more oil in Western Siberia, transporting tens of thousands of workers and building entire cities out of nothing again for oil that may not even exist. Even if it did exist, it's likely to be deep in the Siberian mountains, meaning more expensive equipment, harder explorations, and more manpower. So, production costs went through the roof. This is a classic case of throwing good money after bad. Then, there were the external factors. The global oil market in the 1980s changed dramatically because countries like Mexico, Norway, and the UK suddenly found large offshore oil reserves in their respective territories of the Gulf of Mexico, the North Sea, and the Atlantic Ocean, which creates more competition. The 1980s was also a time when most of the developed countries, especially in Europe and North America, reduced their oil demand by simply using less energy or switching to alternatives like nuclear power, natural gas, coal, and renewables. For example, according to the BP Statistical Review of World Energy, the total oil consumption of Western Europe declined from 15.7 million barrels per day in 1979 to 12.6 million barrels per day in 1985. That's a drop of 20%. This decreasing global demand for oil was mainly because the 1970s was such a horrible time for the global economy because of the 1973 and 1979 oil crises. So, everyone was trying their best to use less oil, and this continued till the late 1980s when oil suddenly got cheaper. And finally, around 1986, oil prices plummeted drastically, and it was the final straw for the Soviets. The average yearly crude oil prices fell from $27 per barrel in 1985 to $14 per barrel in 1986, a drop of 48%. As a result, the Soviets' budget deficit widened, its external debt soared, its trade balance deteriorated, and its currency reserve dwindled. The Soviets had to cut its imports of consumer goods, which only brought more starvation and chaos among the Soviet people, and the slow decline began. The new leadership under Gorbachev tried to implement some economic and political changes, like perestroika for example, but they were either too late or too limited to reverse the decline. The Soviet Union eventually collapsed in 1991. This is Doverhill, and see you next time.